Hello, friends. Welcome back to Lady of the Lore. I'm your host, Kelly Ornelas. I'm very, very excited to be with you guys today because I have a special treat. I recently had the opportunity, the pleasure, to sit down with one of my professors and have a chat with her about some things. And I invited her onto the podcast, and she so graciously accepted my invite. So, I have gone back to introduce this special guest, very dear to my heart. Um, we'll talk about some things that hit on some of the themes that I've kind of been hinting at the past couple of weeks. I hope that you enjoy, and if you do, share this with your friends because it's good stuff. You know it is. So, without further ado, I'll shut up and let Past Me do the talking. All right. Well, I want to first start off by asking if you'll introduce yourself to our audience.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Mandy Link. I am an associate professor at the University of Texas at Tyler, and I teach modern European history, specializing in the two world wars, but also 19th century British Empire. My current research currently revolves around the experience of British and Irish nurses in the post World War I period, and actually how concepts of gender in the post-war years impacted their post-war lives coming out of the worst war that humans had experienced at that point in time. So my connection to this topic today is very close to my heart. So I'm very grateful to get to talk about it.
And for everyone who I haven't gotten the chance to talk about you yet, but I am Dr. Link's acolyte. I've self-proclaimed that title. So she's at the risk of losing brownie points with the other professors. She's my favorite. So
Well, I'm very honored. I'm very honored by that.
awesome. Well, so I want to start by I've kind of already touched on the topic of gender um briefly, briefly and not briefly, but I want to start by asking you to kind of help me define gender again. Just, focusing on we have the biological differences in sex, but also how gender is attached to that sometimes and misused.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that, like you said, you've talked about this in other episodes, but you're absolutely right. And I think today it can be easy for people to conflate those two categories. And really, the conversation, as you point out, is so much more complex than that, right? There's the concept of biological sexes, and then gender is a whole other ball of wax. And gender is the way we as humans over time, right, have consistently redefined and reperformed what we in that period define as what does it mean to be masculine and feminine. And for a long time, it was that binary. Now, obviously, in the modern era, we've had more discussions about how complex those two binary
Mm-hmm.
categories are, but throughout history it's been typically defined right as concepts of masculinity and concepts of femininity that again we continue to redefine and reperform over time, that I think sometimes can be argued to be almost immutable categories, but they're not, right? They are consistently being redefined and changed over time, depending upon,
Mm-hmm.
right, the human experience in those particular eras.
Mm-hmm. Perspective. That's definitely something that I've driven quite harshly and through a few different episodes is that perspective is important, and having the ability to discuss and open up debates in a healthy way with people whose backgrounds are not like mine, not like ours. That's how we obviously learn from those people. So going off of kind of the idea of gender being a performance, you and I have kind of talked about how we give some inanimate objects gender whenever they don't actually require them, and it ends up putting them into boxes also, and creates, I think, kind of almost stigmas around things.
Mhm.
So I've done a little bit of reading on Judith Butler. I'm assuming that you're familiar with her.
Absolutely.
So, how she defines gender as being a performance. And that's referring to the social and cultural differences. Do you have any input on that?
Absolutely. And like you said, we've chatted about this before. And I think one of the most salient, sort of tangible examples of exactly that is, as we discussed before, this example of beverages, which seems, again, kind of, I think initially when you hear that, it seems a little bit strange to think of gender applying to beverages. But if we go back to the 1600s in Europe, they have, Europeans are now consistently in contact with the Americas, right? They're bringing over a lot of food products, and one of those food products is cocoa, which add a little sugar in there, and you have the magical creation of chocolate, and that leads to hot chocolate. And
Yummy.
yeah, and Europeans, particularly the British, come to believe that hot chocolate is a feminine beverage, that chocolate itself is a more feminine decadence, which is interesting because they don't feel that way about sugar generally, chocolate in specific, and hot chocolate as a beverage. And so they come to have these very strange, like, men are not supposed to be seen drinking hot chocolate, like, whether you're at
Mhm.
home or in the local coffee house. No, that's just not seen as a masculine beverage, when really it's just a beverage that tastes delicious. But they see coffee as being kind of the opposite. Coffee is a man's beverage, and it is not acceptable for women. And that was seen as being, like, coffee, because of the amount of caffeine in it, was seen as being a stimulant that would, quote unquote, overwhelm a female's delicate constitution. So you have this creation of these sort of gendered ideas impinging on beverages in a way that, in our modern culture, seems like, again, I mean, how many millions of women get coffee every day, right? So it seems kind of strange.
Right. Yeah. I think I would have been locked up.
Yes, me too. It would have been some rough days without coffee. And to the point, women weren't even allowed in coffee houses because, again, it was seen as just too rough,
Wow.
and again, too overwhelming for women. But tea was fine, which is also kind of comical because we know that black tea in particular has a great deal of caffeine, as much as coffee does. So again, it's not about, it's honestly not really about the beverages, right? It's about creating these gender structures around what you do, in this case, what you consume, and what that message sends to other people around you, and trying to kind of keep people in these particular boxes. And we can even see that today, when we talk about actually still coffee, right? We don't have that same belief that, oh, only men can have coffee. But I think we've all probably seen instances in a coffee shop or a Starbucks where a guy orders a Frappuccino, and people might have perspectives on that, right? There is this strange still thing there of, like, oh, well, that's more of a drink for the ladies. Which, again, it's just a delicious beverage. It shouldn't matter. But again, those kind of concepts are still with us. And, when we react to people ordering those, or we are the person who has to kind of deal with it, right? That's a continued either pushing back against gender expectations in the form of beverages, or it's reenacting them, right? Where maybe that person says, well, I don't want to get that drink because I don't want people to look at me a certain way, right? So it's still with us, even if it seems a very outdated perspective.
It is, and I think that it almost comes to it kind of slaps you in the face a little bit. Like I had told you, I criticized my sister a couple of times for drinking beer because that's a guy's drink. But I also realized that I used to wait tables for my dad, and I would automatically, when it was a group of women at the table and they ordered coffee, I would automatically bring creamer to them, because 9 times out of 10 women aren't drinking black coffee. But then the times that they did, I was like, oh, oh, you're like that kind of girl. But I mean, it's based on personal taste, and if a man desires to order a frappuccino, I don't think that it should be a conversation or any kind of like, what do you mean, So, where do you think the kind of historical origins of these traditional gender roles or traditional notions of gender come from?
I think, a lot of historians as well as anthropologists have argued that, we kind of have to get in our way back time machine and go back to the shift of human beings from hunter gatherers to more settled sedentary agricultural societies. And recent, digs and research from anthropologists have really supported this, that, in hunter gatherer societies, the goal is survival, and everyone's role is important and equal in that, right? And quite a few anthropologists have pointed out, not only did women in hunter-gatherer societies participate in hunting, but they were more often the gatherers. And they've pointed out that, when you go hunting, as modern day hunters know, you don't always get something, right? But gatherers, you can always get something, right? So if they don't find something to kill, right, to eat that night for dinner, you still have whatever you've gathered, right? So at the end of the day, hunter gatherer roles in that society are really equal, right? They're both providing equally for the survival of their people. But the historical argument is, once we as human beings create agricultural settlements, right, and we're in one place, we start to see over time the evolution of different societal roles. And through that evolution, right, over time, we start to see property, the concept of property, becoming very important, right? You're amassing wealth, resources, whatever that means, right, in that particular time period. And that as that happens, right, if you are a family and you've now amassed this, right, you want to pass on all that property to one person, right? Kind of keep it in the family, keep that wealth going so the next generation can increase on that. And then, again, the historical argument goes, in that you start to see this shift into these gender roles, right? Women are the ones that have the children, right? And then at the end of the day, the argument goes that a woman always knows that's her baby, right? Because she's the one who carries it and births it. But that a man cannot necessarily know that that is his child, right? So again, historians have made the argument this creates I should say this leads humans to create more strict laws about marriage, inheritance, right? So that the husband slash father can be more sure, I suppose, that that child is his, and that therefore the inheritor of all this property and wealth that's been amassed actually goes to their biological heir. So again, this is an argument a lot of historians and anthropologists have made, that it's, and this happens over hundreds of years, right? More than that even, but that it's this kind of progression that's very much tied to concepts of property and wealth. Which, I mean, how many things in history go back to property and wealth, right?
Right. And so that's interesting. And I was kind of thinking for the hunter gatherer idea, I obviously we're thinking in like 21st century mindset where the men strap on their camo and go out into the woods to search for deer. But, I imagine that women were also facing kind of the same hardship along the path of gathering. Like it's not that it was a masculine activity. It was both kind of similar as far as function. And then still, it seems because we still have that argument from the opposite side who claim, like gender roles aren't as, um, problematic as we make it out to be, because there were always, there was hunters and gatherers, just like there was kind of, so that represents to them a type of hierarchy. But to me it doesn't really sound like a hierarchy if we really sit there and think about the um responsibilities, I guess, that came with being a hunter or being a gatherer.
Absolutely. And anthropologists have discovered evidence that points to there were men that were gatherers and there were women that were hunters, that they're not immutable categories based on, again, someone's perceived biological sex, right? That it was wherever you function the best in that society, that's the best for everyone. And that there were people who weren't in the hunting or gathering categories, but they're back at, wherever you kind of made your base for that week or month or whatever, taking care of, right, the children, right? Someone has to do that because kids can't go on the hunt, right? Like someone has to do all these jobs, and they're not necessarily one group or the other. It's, again, how that particular group decided to divide up the jobs, right, was who's best for it, because that's what leads to survival. So yeah, it's less predicated on any expectations.
And I like entertaining and kind of going back to, like you're saying, almost like dawn of time type of conversation, because it's that is something that I'm I'm countered with typically. It's usually, well, this is the thing, this is the way that things have always been. We can't go and break tradition. This is how it is. It's interesting to kind of come back and see, okay, so it wasn't. This is almost all of these ideas based on femininity, based on masculinity. It's a social, it's something that's come socially, that we've gotten together in a group and are coming up with all of these sorts of ideas that create, women as this emotional inferior species who are bound to become mothers, become wives, and then you have the men who are the providers and the protectors. And it seems like if you actually go back and you look at the historical argument, which is what I've tried to indoctrinate my my audience on, please, let's not talk about just the social arguments, but also look at what is in black and white. We can't lie about that. There is
Mhm.
no politics to the past if you
Mhm.
really just study the past. So how do you think so I've touched on the Enlightenment and we kind of discussed that a little bit. The Enlightenment comes after we start establishing obviously societies, and so how do you think that that has kind of pulled us into where we are now? Because I want to make sure that I'm not focusing all on these are all historical topics, yes, but in telling you the historical accuracy of it, whatever we want to call it, I'm trying to prove a point that it it is a problem for us today, right? Just like talking about the gendered coffee. So where do you think the Enlightenment has brought us to?
That's a wonderful question, and I've also thought about that a lot because the Enlightenment is such a groundbreaking intellectual movement in how it just, these intellectuals trying to break away from the influence of like the Catholic Church, break away from like traditional forms of authority like monarchy, and say, well, what's the true nature of human beings? And if we can figure that out, we can figure out what the best form of society and government is. And I'd say we're still trying to figure all of those questions out. And I think what the Enlightenment does, and obviously there's so many different thoughts that come out of it, but I think generally the Enlightenment provides this springboard for later movements in regards to this conversation, like suffrage, right? And this rethinking of people's roles in society, particularly women. It will also give people of color a springboard for later activism as well. But I think the Enlightenment philosophers, especially the female Enlightenment philosophers, are saying, that's all well and good that we want to think about who humans are, like when we're born, and what, like, are we, naturally good, are we naturally bad, how is a society supposed to function? But these female philosophers are the ones entering the chat, as it were, and saying, yeah, but you realize a lot of what you're saying is predicated on these very old, centuries and centuries old patriarchal structures that, when, these Enlightenment philosophers say things like all men are born equal, they literally mean all men, right? Like, to a lot of Enlightenment philosophers, women aren't even entering their thoughts. And so you have these female philosophers coming along and saying, yes, and, right? Yes, but women. And you have like Mary Wollstonecraft, right, in The Vindication of the Rights of Women, saying, you're wasting the potential of half the population by putting them in these tiny, tiny, narrow boxes. And then, of course, suffrage, right? Suffragists will build on that for the next 150 years, those ideas. And I think we're still building on that. I mean, when you look at second wave feminism or even third wave feminism, right, there's a lot that harkens back to that and says, if you're going to have this conversation about the sexes and then our concepts of gender, again, we have to unpack, as you said, all these historical roots, because if we don't, it's hard to move forward, right? And try to unpack this moving forward if we don't understand how we got here in the first place. And I think the Enlightenment is the first big conversation of exactly that, because women push back, right? And again, not all of them, right? But these philosophers in particular.
Right. So where, and this is kind of like, I don't know if it's even answerable, I'm not sure, but attached to these roles that were prescribed for women, once we start becoming a more, modern type of species, but once we get to that point, how does the emotional instability of women come to a head? Where does that come from? Is it all just social, societal norms? I mean, how does that come to be?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll try to keep my answer relatively short just for the interest of time. uh, I could talk forever about that. I think again, like so many other things we're talking about, it is such an evolution over time, and so much of it is really tied up with where medicine is at in different time periods. In and also religion, right? A lot of it in the Western world, right, is very much tied to predominantly the Catholic Church for a very long time. And that takes its cue from the Bible, right? The idea that Eve is made from the rib of Adam, right? Uh, and over time, right? And then as medicine develops, there's this shift in belief of, again, women are the quote unquote weaker sex, which is, I think, from a modern standpoint, sounds crazy when you think about, even just the biological ability for, I guess in this case, cisgender women to have babies. That is no weaker thing for a person to do. But there is that perspective that women are the weaker sex, that we have more fragile brains, more fragile bodies.
Can't have coffee.
Exactly. We can't even handle coffee, let alone, goodness knows what else. Um, Despite the fact there are so many examples to the contrary, right? We have so many historical examples of female warriors and, again, handling things way more intense than coffee. But those are always seen as the exception, right? The exception, not the rule. And that continues for a very long time. Um, but I think that, particularly with the influence of medicine, oh, I know what I was going to say, that a lot of historians have pointed out that this is also a performance, right? This is a narrative, this is rhetoric that's kind of constantly brought up to keep these gender roles in place. And again, keep men in this patriarchal structure, right? Higher, right? Of to say, well, you should be lower because you are weaker and your bodies are frailer and your minds are frailer, right? To the point that, for well-educated European women, they weren't even supposed to study math or science or history or politics because the belief was it would overwhelm our feeble brains, which again sounds comical to say now, but it was very much the belief. And that women who were like Mary Wollstonecraft or these other intellectuals were again seen as the exception rather than the rule. The 19th century, I think, is where it really gets worse, which sounds strange to say, but that's because of the development of medicine.
Well, is it strange?
Right.
Is it strange, or it's also the 19th century is whenever we start seeing more suffrage movements as well. So it's
Yes.
like it's met head to head, and it's in response to more
Yes,
so.
you're absolutely on point. Exactly. The more women push back from the mid 19th century onward, you're exactly right. And the more medicine progresses and becomes more professionalized, doctors actually have to go to school to call themselves a doctor. The more they do that and they push women out of medicine, the more we see this. Again, now they're kind of using science and medicine as a way to say, oh, now we've always believed you were the weaker sex, but now we have quote unquote science to prove that. And it's very much tied up in a lot of, social Darwinist beliefs of the 19th century. Women are part of that as well, right? So now they can claim that science is telling them that that women are the weaker sex, that women are, right? This is when you really see the popularity of the term hysteria or hysterical used. I mean, it existed, of course, long before, but it becomes very popular of, quote unquote uppity women, right? Or women who voice their thoughts, right? Could be called hysterical. They could be confined to an asylum just because their husband said, confine her to an asylum because she talked in a way he didn't appreciate her. It could be any manner of minor things, right? But it becomes, again, attached to medicine. And then that makes it easier to reinforce that image of women who step out of line. There's a clear and definite threat there as well, right? Of incarceration or even into the 20th century, like when lobotomies become popular, like a lot of women who suffer from, what we would now see as depression, bipolar disorder, they're just lobotomized. They're just lobotomized. And so there's a real and present threat to women through medicine, again, of saying, if you step out of line from what we say is your acceptable role, there's very real and dire consequences that can happen to you, right? Trying to reinforce, toe the line, act the way we want you to, or, right, very dire things can happen to you.
Right. So attached to that also, obviously, since we're entering kind of the realm of medicine, are the kind of implications regarding mental health, right? Um, I have heard, obviously, we've probably both heard that not only are we the inferior species, but we're so much more emotional than men. When truly all of the experiences that we have as human beings, men are very likely to experience the same feelings that I do as a female. There's mad, being upset, the depression and anxiety. I know that that afflicts not just women. So, what continues, do you think, to limit that? That men, obviously, we have the notion of being a man. That's something that I can't quite put my finger on. I guess I'd like to think that we've entered a more modern era where the internet's a safe place for some people, and they're able to express themselves through garnering validation from other people who experience similar things. But where what do you think continues to press that narrative of women are more emotional and therefore men don't end up expressing themselves?
I thought it's a great question. I've thought about that a lot as
I'm
well.
getting a little philosophical.
No, I love it because it's a fascinating conversation, and I think part of it is this concept of performance and generational, right? Like how you were raised,
Right.
what the men in your as a child, like your father, your uncles, your grandfather, whoever you may have had present, or if you didn't have a strong male figure present, right? But however you're getting those as a young man into adulthood, right? The concept of however you're raised, right? We talk about that a lot now, right? Like generational uh, things that we inherit generationally that are not genetic, right, through our environment and how we're raised. And it
The
also
generational
requires
trauma.
exactly. And I think there's partly that, right, like how you were raised, and then whether or not you question that as an adult, right? And I think you're right. There's some really
Right.
positive things to social media, and a lot of men talking about much more about that now. I think particularly millennials and Gen Z men, there's more in those two generations conversation of like being allowed to just feel things, right? And you're right, like
Mm-hmm.
the exact same capacity. But I think for a long time, the narrative, like you said, is from a young child standpoint, right? Boys don't cry, right? Boys don't do this, which, right? Psychologists have demonstrated how damaging that is, right, to the emotional development of a child. And on the flip side, there's been a lot of studies that have shown that young girls, for instance, are taught particularly not to swear and are told like that's not ladylike, right? Boys, yeah, they're told, well, don't swear until you're older, right? That there's this just different handling of
Mm-hmm.
that, which I think is an interesting kind of flip.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I think it's a lot of generational. I think it's a lot of how we're raised. And then whether or not you are confronted or change that, right, in adulthood, right, that's obviously up to an individual person. But as you were saying
Mm-hmm.
with the gendered beverage thing, a lot of things we do and we don't even realize it, right? Because it's just there,
Right.
right? We just kind of do until someone says something, or maybe you
Makes us
see
aware.
exactly, or I see a TikTok and you're like, oh, I've never thought
It
about
lets us in on the lore.
that. That's right, exactly,
The
exactly.
TikTok discourse, it can be educational. So what, and I kind of want to hit on the fact that all of that is obviously very suppressive. It's continues to it puts women down, but as we're trying to make clear, it also does so for men as well, and also non-binary individuals too. So moving into kind of how these ideals force people into corners. We have the emergence of toxic masculinity, right? We've heard about this. The internet tells us all about it. I've recently done some digging on toxic femininity. Just the idea of there's something floating around, being in your whatever era, and being in your Fleabag era is a thing right now, which is about the TV show. I don't know. Have you seen that?
I have, yeah.
So, okay. So that one is supposed to be almost like allowing chaos to overtake your actions, and then thriving or not really thriving on that, but just harnessing it and allowing that to take over your life instead of actually seeking mental health help should you need it, right? Being in your depression era, being in whatever
Gotcha.
era, it's not as, I guess it's not as cute, even if it's trendy. And I think that that is stemming from, not like other girls, not trying to be like other girls, is rejecting the stereotypes, but almost rejecting in an extreme way, right? In a now you're on the opposite side of that spectrum, and we also got to bring you back a little bit because again, we're looking at how these norms are. If we don't address them, you answer by becoming the opposite of what we're desiring. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So I'm thinking of some examples. We'll go back into the toxic femininity, because that's kind of, for me at least, a new idea. It's not something that I had kind of focused on. Obviously, you have women who are responsible for also being toxic, saying, like, that's not what it's like being a real man. Even conversations that I've had with my friends, oh, a real man wouldn't do that. But what qualifies a real man, right? So I kind of want to give some examples of how we allow, because we're here in 2024, how we allow these roles to, it gives people platforms almost. And I mentioned Andrew Tate. He's someone who, I mean, people are fanatics about him, and I don't get it, mainly because the system that he's prescribing also oppresses men, right? So where does the interest in that come from? Do you have any input on that?
That is such a great question. I thought about that a lot as well, because you're right. He is both wildly divisive and, like you said, has a huge, almost cult-like following. And when you've looked, I'm sure a lot of people have even perused maybe his Instagram or TikTok just to get an idea of who is this guy, right? And when you see that, I think part of what he's selling is luxury, right? This idea of being insanely wealthy and having all the trappings of wealth, right? The clothes, the watches, the ladies, the cars, all that stuff. And I think that partly that is very attractive to a lot of people, right? This idea of just having that kind of disposable wealth and that lifestyle. But then you're right, when he says the things that he says, it is hard to see why men, right, would even be interested in that. But I think a lot of, when it comes down to talking about people's perspectives or rejections of gender roles or other feelings about it, is I think a lot of it is fear and anxiety based. And we see throughout history, the more society struggles with change, which is a bit ironic because change is the only constant in the human experience, but we don't like it. As a group, humans,
Mm-hmm.
we do not
It's
do well with it.
uncomfortable.
We don't like it. Exactly. It's so uncomfortable. And the more we have these societal conversations about gender roles, right, and you're saying we're entering into this much more complex conversation of cisgender, right, trans people, right, like non-binary people, right? What do these old kind of clunky conceptions of gender mean now, right? That we're expanding the conversation, and I think a lot of people are really fearful about what that means, and so someone like an Andrew Tate, who's projecting this kind of almost old school Mad Men era, right? This is, like you said, this is what a quote unquote man is, right? He has money,
Mm-hmm.
he has power, he has, ladies all around, right? This kind of, and I think probably for some people that's very attractive. It's aspirational for one thing, but then also it seems like something they're familiar with, right? Something that's not new and
Interesting.
scary. It's something very old and familiar. And I think in times of great change, people really latch onto that kind of thing. I'm sure there's many more reasons, but I think that's probably a big one for some people.
Well, and that's, I think that is also, I mean, it's very accurate. It would make sense. It's kind of the reason why you see people voting for people who don't really deserve it. But I mean, there's also kind of the opposite side that I don't think many people see or understand, and that's my intention here. There is, my brother actually is the one that let me in on some drama with the What's Up Brother. Is he a streamer? I think his name is Sketch. So recently there was some pornographic materials found that he was in, and it was he was engaged with another man, and there is so much that has now come out that they are attacking this man for his sexuality. And he has now created a video where, you have the people who are like, this isn't a man, this isn't what a man does, blah blah blah, the old I'm not even going to give any more thought to it, but he released a video apologizing, saying, "This is not me. I'm so sorry that I disappointed you guys," because he didn't live up to that standard. And that is just a single example, right? Because he had created a massive following. There were men and women who were, using his little tagline and were so interested in what he was doing. He was creating brand deals and all of these things. And we allow something like this that is a part of that prescripted structure to just uproot everything that he had, or to create him like he's some different kind of person. And so I think that is what is dangerous about subscribing to those narratives and to letting them dictate the way that we think, the way that we treat people. I mean, it is insane. And I want to get into how stereotyping is like being in a cage. I I kind of made the allusion to you about caged men or caged women being pushed into that corner, and you have the option of cowering and putting your tail between your legs and accepting whatever is given to you, or that you become a little rabid. And we have studied examples from World War II era, which has become one of my, I guess it sounds a little dark to say favorite, but one of my favorite examples. So if you would be so kind as to let my ladies and gentle people in on some of those like high profile, we talked about true crime, but also those that we learned about where we even had women in the killing fields for the Nazis.
Absolutely. And one thing I wanted to say back to your previous point is one thing you've identified really well there with that streamer is the homophobic undertones of toxic masculinity, right? That
Right.
technically this guy didn't do anything illegal or wrong, right? But and from my understanding, it was on OnlyFans too. So it's not like it's just
Hmm.
for random public consumption, right? Like
Right.
so there's some homophobic undertones to the way toxic masculinity is usually
Well, because
expressed or used.
along with patriarchal schools of thought, it's, you have your role to play, and that role is being a heterosexual male, and you
Yes.
stick with that. You walk that tightrope, right? And there is nothing else that you may do outside of it. And I guess that a lot of men in this conversation, there might be responses that say, "So, see, do you see how we put up with things too?" And I don't like that response. I mean, it's not. I'm not asking or saying yes. So there's that, and that's okay. So that's a conversation that I've had, and an argument that it needs to be dissected. But I guess that's just based on perspective as well.
Hmm. Absolutely. But to your point about these historical examples and like you said in the Second World War, women participating and and that's something we don't think about as I think society a lot, and we still struggle with is and how that kind of women are supposed to be naturally maternal and nurturing when really women have just as much capacity to be all the opposite of that, right? um, and that's especially true in a heightened case, right? Like you said, in World War II, where we do have examples of women in Nazi Germany taking part in the Holocaust, taking part in the killing fields, as you said, of Jewish victims of the Holocaust, as well as in the camps, of the many victims in the camps, women participating in incredibly brutal violence. And then in the post war period are not punished on par with male perpetrators because there's this difficulty. First of all, there's this difficulty for a lot of people to wrap their mind around the Holocaust as a totality, right? Because it's so horrific. But then to wrap your mind around the fact that women participated, right, in the executions, the gassing, the
Of
torture of people.
children.
Yes, and of children. It's just, and I think when people do hear that, they kind of will sometimes, oh, well, it was the Nazis, of course, which fair, they did a lot of horrific things. But we see other examples of this in other time periods, right? That there are women don't necessarily historically have as much access to that kind of rampant violence, but there are definitely occasions when they do they can perform just as horrific acts as the men standing next to them. And like you said, we had talked about crime in a previous conversation, true crime. Like we still see this, right, with female serial killers, or like, for instance, the very infamous case of Casey Anthony, right, who was put on trial for killing her toddler. People felt, I mean, that was a divisive case, right? Because people could not understand how this young mother could do this to her child, right? No matter where you fell and if she did it or not was kind of irrelevant. People still just could not wrap their mind around a mother doing this to their children. And we see that every time those cases come up. But again, it's something we're still dealing with, this acknowledgement that women have the exact same range of emotions and abilities, and sometimes that does trend towards violence, right, as men do. We still have a hard time reckoning with that, even with all the examples, right? We like to see them as a one-off, right, as the exception, that this is not common.
And it's like, at what point does the exception begin to outweigh the standard? And then are we willing at that point to finally acknowledge, okay, so maybe there is no standard after all, right? So I recently got into reading on kind of the differentiation between the treatment of female convicts. And these were a couple of ladies who were on death row. And so there was a conversation, and I think it was actually a dissertation or something that I was reading, and there was a difference between two different cases. Both of these women were sentenced to death for murdering their spouses, and there was a difference between the public's response to their executions, or their impending executions. One of them goes to prison. Her name is Carla Faye Tucker, for my individuals who are interested. So Carla was imprisoned, and once there finds God and converts to Christianity. She ends up marrying a Christian minister, and this marriage is seen as pure and virginal because of obviously being imprisoned. And she was a beautiful brunette woman. She had long hair, very feminine, so to speak. And then you have across the way, I believe Carla Faye was in Texas, and then there was another woman in Florida who, she was also convicted of the same crime. She had shorter hair. She was more kind of older looking, not what I guess everyone would call the standard of femininity, right? So she transgressed those ideals, and in doing so, kind of got the opposite from the public that Carla got. Carla got, this woman is converted, she's changed, she's worthy of redemption. Poor her. And then you have the woman in Florida. This is a black widow. She's responsible for awful things, and had apparently, according to other people who were familiar with her, was a Christian as well. Like there was no difference in their religious beliefs, but it's in the way that they looked and the way that they appeared, I guess, on the outside, that it really, that to me, obviously they both ended up being executed for their crimes. I don't think that femininity got them out of anything, but it's almost interesting to understand how your ideas of femininity influence the way that you think women are able to, or capable of, committing crimes, but also your response to how they are punished for them.
Absolutely. And that's such a great example. Those two, and like you said, everything being so similar, right? The kind of crimes, right? They both were sort of, sounds like kind of born again Christians, right? But yeah, that one gets this, but she's quote unquote better now, right? Like maybe commute her sentence, etc. And that brings to mind a case, and unfortunately I don't remember her name, but it's pretty famous. She was an elderly woman. She was like in her 70s, and she was convicted of being a serial killer. She was murdering people she took in and cared for. And people had kind of it was feminine, but it was in that, like, well, she's just like a grandma type. She couldn't possibly have done this, even though she'd been doing it since she was in her 40s. But again, less in the attractiveness sense, but in the, like, well, she's a grandma. Like, grandmas are inherently caring, maternal, nurturing types. This lady was not, obviously. But yeah, it really impacts. And that's such a fascinating thing I think about the criminal justice system is we hear that a lot, right? People's expectations of who these people on trial are so impactful on how the trial itself comes out, right? How we perceive them, or even what happens after the trial, right? Obviously going back to the Casey Anthony case, she was not convicted, and there are still a lot of people that think she should have been. Again, that gets into a whole criminal justice world that I don't know enough about to dive into, but people
Me
still
neither.
feel like that in some way she subverted the natural order of the mother-child relationship to enough extent, particularly because she was young and she was very much known for partying, etc. That was enough to condemn her, right, in the eyes of people, whether or not the courts found her guilty. So kind of similar, right? Like who our expectations of these women and then the evidence against them, right, seem to be at
Right.
odds, like you said.
So, and I'm not sure if this is kind of related to these things, but we had mentioned kind of how that fits into the Madonna whore complex of things. And I don't know enough about that at all. So, how do you say, or would you say that that fits in here?
That's a great question. And the sort of Madonna whore complex, as historians refer to it, is a way that historians, particularly in the 80s, when you see, gender history taking off, right, women's history taking off, talking about that so many women in history before that movement were either portrayed as one or the other, right? Women only got to be two things historically, either a perfect Madonna, right, where she's, like a Abigail Adams or Martha Washington, right? These like kind of heroic Titan-sized ladies, right, who did positive things, right? And then on the opposite end, right, women could either be really horrible and be put in that whore category, right, of being villainesses, right? And this lack of understanding, as historians today obviously do it, humans in life is way more complex than, right, this black and white categorization. And I think that does kind of fit here, right, of these women when they are on trial, right, that yeah, they are kind of lumped into one or the other, and people not even intentionally knowing that they're doing that, right? But like you said, well, this woman is, again, she's born again, she's also beautiful. Did she really do these things? Or maybe she was
Could she
just
be
under the influence
capable?
of someone. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And then, saying with these other women, well, no, she definitely did these terrible things and she doesn't deserve a second chance. I think you're absolutely right. And you're right. We still do that a lot, right? Women are kind of either good or evil rather than honestly the gray area where I think probably is probably the truth most of the time. Yeah.
And it's just really the intention of trying to get away from that standardized thinking, right? The like, this is just the way that things are. And that's clearly not true. And we're really breaking that down. And do you think that my point was that education is really one of the main ways that we're going to dismantle this system, as it were? Do you think that there are other ways apart? Because education, I've tried to say, it doesn't just come in the form of degrees. It also comes in just discourse with other people. Do you think that there are other ways, or do you kind of envision a future where we have that progress?
Yes. And I think you're absolutely right. Education comes in so many forms. I think, like you said, discourse is one of the most important. I think, particularly intergenerational discourse. I think some of the most
Oh,
valuable conversations I've had in my personal life are with my mom, my aunts, my grandmothers, right? And that sharing of stories, right? And them hearing, my experiences, me hearing theirs, right? And that connection of them realizing how much things have changed and at the same time many things have stayed the same, right? And then me realizing, right, like, wow, how much they, and them not even knowing, right, that they were consciously doing things to move things forward, right? Because they're just going, I was just living my life, I was just doing my best, but I think that intergenerational conversation among women is incredibly important, but also with men, like conversations with the men in your life, whether it is brothers, husbands, fathers, grandfathers, right? Those conversations are really important as well. And I think that's an easier thing because when you're talking to a person in your family who, there's love and respect there, and if you can have that conversation, you're both going to be more likely to actually hear, right, what the other one is saying, rather than kind of like online where you're just people get ready for a fight, right? And there's no conversation happening. I think also, and this might sound kind of, I don't know, out of the field, but I think sometimes television and movies can be some of the most helpful because they're almost, not that they have an agenda necessarily, but they're almost like can sometimes sneak in a bit of this. And what immediately comes to mind is one of my personal favorite shows is New Girl. I mean, I've rewatched that show more times than
Oh,
I can count. And one of the best things
well, welcome
about
to
that
the club.
show, yes, oh, yes, one of the best things about that show are the friendships, right? The friendship between Jess and Cece, right? It's such a positive example of female friendship. There's no backbiting. They have fights, but they're never about catty things, right? Like they're not a 1980s teen movie. They're about real things that real friends are going to argue about, but they always find a way through it. And then on the other side, you have male friendships, really positive male friendships, like between Nick, Winston, and Schmidt. I think Schmidt is one of the best characters in recent television history because he doesn't
I
adhere
agree.
to a lot of this toxic masculine. Like he does for a bit, and then you watch him learn and break that down and let who
Bro,
he really is out. Yes. And that's one of the best things about that show, I think, is again the friendships, both female and male friendships, but then the friendships between the female and male characters as well are incredibly positive. And I think things like that are really helpful too, of showing again on TV, they're not beating the audience over the head and saying, look, we're showing you not toxic male characters. They're just showing you it. Like I think I saw an article once that Winston from the show is like television's least problematic male character. And I think they're probably right. But
no,
yeah,
I
so,
agree.
yeah, I think things like that are really telling and just reflecting back that not everybody has to fit into these categories, right? That you can still identify however you do, right? Whether that's non-binary, and we're increasingly seeing more of those characters in television as well. Or if you identify as male or female, right? That you can just be whoever you are and you don't have to be
Right.
in these categories. And when you see that reflected back to you through pop culture, I think that's representation matters, right? That's very helpful, I think, rather than sort of maybe a show like, say, How I Met Your Mother, right? Where you've got a character like Barney Stinson, which is very has not aged well, I think we could say, but is very that toxic masculinity, right? So we've
Hmm.
come even far in some terms of television representation of again how people act, right? Kind of how they perform when they're around other
Right.
people, and I think that's really helpful. Again, it creates diversity of the human experience that people are already living, but just on television.
Right. And it all I think comes back to validating those experiences and understanding, and right, you're saying creating an understanding that you do not have to stay in that box. And I think that we've covered all of my questions that I have for you. You were a phenomenal guest, which did not
Oh, thank you.
surprise me at all. So thank you very much for all of your help and your input today. Um, unless you have anything else, we can bid our audience farewell.
No, thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.